Thanks very much, Maarten, and good morning or good afternoon or good evening, everyone, depending on where you're joining. Sharon or Nick, could you please put up the first slides? Thank you very much. So, yeah, we are in this session on consumption and consumer behavior. Like yesterday, we will have all attendees on mute, but you can use the Q&A box for your questions. You can do that throughout all the presentations, but we will only get to the questions at the end of all the presentations. So please, when you write your questions in the Q&A box, please indicate which of the panelists your question is for. Could I have the next slide, please? So for this session, the panelists had a set of guiding questions that they could use as inspiration for their presentations. And each of the presentations will touch on one or more of these questions implicitly or explicitly. So these questions are: how are species of small and low-cost fish embedded in local food cultures? What factors such as social class, ethnicity, social mobility, and gender affect food preferences and practices? How do food preferences and practices affect access to value chains for small and low-cost fish, and what obstacles exist? And to what extent do policymakers encourage the consumption of small and low-cost fish, and by what means? Next slide, please. So we will have 5 speakers today, and I will introduce each of them as they start their presentation. But I just want to say a few words first about this session. So as we heard yesterday, fish is not a homogeneous food group when it comes to nutrition. So there's really a difference between the different species, and as we heard, small low-cost fish are very important for nutrition. And consumer demand for fish is obviously affected by prices of fish and income levels. And research has shown that different fish species have different elasticities of price and income. So that means that consumers, the way that consumers respond to changes in prices of fish and changes in their income levels. So that really emphasizes that it's really important to look at consumer demand and also differentiate there between different species. So we've also heard yesterday that that there are specific groups of people within households that need the nutrients in fish more than others, such as children in the first 1,000 days of life and pregnant and lactating women. It therefore really matters how fish is divided in the household, but this in turn depends on different cultural practices and beliefs about fish consumption. And so this is really about consumer behavior and social norms, and also how households make decisions and how decision-making power is distributed within the household. Apart from these consumer behaviors and social norms, local consumer demands are also affected by a number of external forces that influence how people shop for food and also what they buy, such as increasing globalization, rising incomes, urbanization, and also demographic developments. So, and all of that results in changes in food habits and behavior. So, for example, there is more processed and convenient foods that are being bought as a result of more households with all adults working in paid jobs and therefore requiring time-saving products. And there's also a rise of meat consumption as a result of rising incomes. And we see all over the world this rise of supermarkets and more formal market channels that have less choice and variety of fish products, and in particular of small low-cost fish. But as we will hear from our second presenter today about the Ga community in Jamestown, Ghana, local food cultures can be quite strong and persist. So this begs the question, are government policies really needed when there is demand for small fish already? However, policymaking around food and nutrition security sometimes may actually result in consumer behavior shifting away from small fish. And some of the presentations in this session will show this. So our first presentation is about trends in South and Southeast Asia, where small freshwater fish were once abundant, but are becoming scarcer and more expensive and are substituted by farmed fish and processed small low-cost marine fish. The presentation will also discuss that human consumption competes for small marine fish with fish meal production, and we've also heard this yesterday, for animal feeds, including for aquaculture. Clearly, government policies to promote aquaculture for income may therefore have an effect on what fish is available to people. Our third, fourth, and fifth presentation in this session are about India and Indonesia. And they will show that informal market channels such as mobile vendors and other informal traders are key sources for small fish. Government policy and other external forces of modernization may increasingly push consumers towards more formal market channels, as I said earlier, such as supermarkets, which do not offer much small fish, thus reducing people's access and eventually changing preferences. Longer, more formal market channels also mean a higher degree of partially processed or frozen fish, which in many places still has a negative connotation to people. Basically saying that frozen fish is old fish, it's not fresh. So that may push people away from eating fish altogether. Similarly, promotion of aquaculture as a source of income may result in an abundance of fish in markets that does not meet people's preferences. And in some countries, there's still an idea that aquaculture fish is associated with food safety hazards, for example. So perhaps the conclusion of our session could be that at a minimum, policymakers need to ensure that policies do not run counter to maintaining preferences and food habits around small fish. And the presentations that we will shortly see will point to a number of areas where policymakers can play a role. For example, proactively promoting small fish as a nutritious food through national dietary guidelines and educational and behavioral change programs directed at those responsible for food purchasing and preparation in families, but also entire families, to ensure that issues related to social norms and beliefs are addressed. And this should be accompanied by continued research on the best ways of doing this. Another role that policymakers can play is to ensure that policies to promote income generation take into account potential negative effects on nutrition, and not only consider the economic benefits, but also the potential health costs of a particular policy. And Dr. Tilstedt referred to that yesterday as nutrition-sensitive approaches. Policymakers can also provide an enabling environment for informal and shorter market channels to continue to flourish, or find ways to integrate small fish into more formal market channels. While catch and distribution are obviously of key importance for access, availability, and affordability of fish to consumers, consumer demand is what really drives this. So if consumers demand a product, it's quite likely that you'll find an entrepreneur that can be motivated to supply it. Another role of policymakers could be to promote the development of convenient products based on small low-cost fish that meet changing needs of consumers. And as we heard yesterday afternoon, provide an enabling environment for private sector partners to really take an active role in this. As was also discussed yesterday, it will also be important to continue to look at how demand will affect the price of small fish to ensure that it will continue to be low cost and affordable to low income consumers if demand from different income groups increases. So with that, I'd like to turn to our first speaker of today. Ben, if you could switch on your camera. There we go. And if we could go to the next slide. Thank you very much. So our next presenter is Ben Belton. He's an associate professor of international development at Michigan State University in the US, and a senior scientist of value chains and nutrition at World Fish based in Penang. He's a rural sociologist who has worked extensively in South and Southeast Asia in countries including Myanmar, Bangladesh, Vietnam, and Thailand. Ben's work focuses on the political economy of aquaculture and capture fisheries development, agricultural value chains and food systems, rural economies, and their links to food and nutrition security, poverty, well-being, and the environment. Ben will present on small low-cost fish in South and Southeast Asia, roles and consumption trends. Ben, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Froukje. So as you've said, I'm talking about small low-cost fish in South and Southeast Asia, drawing particularly on research done in Bangladesh and Myanmar. Next slide, please. Okay, so running through the outline of the presentation, first of all, I want to emphasize that small low-cost fish come from both freshwater and marine sources, and from many different types of fishery. They're consumed both in processed and many different, in fresh and many different processed forms. And particularly small freshwater fish are becoming increasingly scarce and expensive. And so that's driving substitutions both of farmed fish for inland capture fish and marine fish in some cases. And then there's also competition occurring for marine fish, and that's occurring in different ways, small low-cost marine fish. Okay, next slide, please. So just to illustrate here what we're talking about, on the left-hand side of the slide is a pile of multiple species of small fish. This is from a retail market in Bangladesh. And you can see there's a whole mixture being sold here together as a single lot. And then so on the right, some small pelagic marine fish. Next slide, please. Okay, so these are sourced from a wide diversity of fisheries. On the left-hand side at the top, you can see this is a rice field fishery. So this is sort of the smallest scale, most artisanal kind of source of fish. And so this is taken on a rainy day, and the water's flowing through the fields, and the whole village was basically out in the fields harvesting these small fish that are moving to feed and breed. The image below this is also a rice field fishery. This one is in Myanmar, and you can see here the whole rice fields are completely underwater, and there are people out in their boats. But then sort of moving to slightly larger inland fisheries here at the top in the middle. This is again in Bangladesh. But inland fisheries can go up to actually very large scale with sort of fixed gears in Myanmar and Cambodia, for instance. At the bottom, we have an image of artisanal fisheries in marine fisheries in Bangladesh. And then somehow the picture has disappeared on the right, but this is showing here we are, a very large boat in Myanmar. So this fish is offshore for long periods of time. It catches large fish, but it also catches smaller fish as well. Okay, next slide, please. And so just as fish, this small low-cost fish is caught from many different types of fisheries, it's also consumed in many different ways. So on the left, we have sort of the most basic way. This is just fresh, small fish in a market. In the middle, you can see many different types of small dried fish here in a market in Bangladesh. And on the right, we have fermented fish paste, but there are also many other fermented products. So for instance, fish sauce, which is produced almost exclusively with small fish also. Okay, next slide, please. So this graph here is from a recent survey in Myanmar, and this is looking at consumption of any fish. So this is just to underline the point of how important processed fish is as compared to fresh fish. So these are various different regions of the country. So from the coast all the way through the delta inland, and you can see that basically people are consuming processed fish, so dried and fermented fish, as frequently as they're consuming fresh fish. And in very many cases, and especially with the marine fish, that processed fish is made of small low-cost fish species. Next slide, please. Okay, this graph is illustrating some research from Bangladesh. So this is price data from retail markets collected over a 3-year period, 25 retail markets in 6 different regions of Bangladesh. And we collected information on fish prices on a weekly basis. So you can see the dotted lines are 2 small freshwater fish. So puti, which is a very abundant small fish, a barb, and mola, which is this famous, very nutrient-rich small fish. The solid lines are various different species of farm fish, and you can see that over this actually quite short period of time, the prices of the farm fish remain very stable, while the prices of the small freshwater fish increased quite considerably. So for instance, puti was about 100 taka per kilogram at the start of the period. It rose to about 150 taka per kilo by the end of the period. Next slide, please. So I should have said part of the reason that small inland fish, freshwater fish, are becoming more expensive is a main driver of that is habitat conversion. So agricultural intensification and basically building on wetlands. So as a result, there's this sort of shift or substitution increasingly, so people consuming aquaculture farmed fish instead. So this is nicely illustrated here by two pictures from Myanmar. On the left, we have these fish balls, which are a very popular product, and they're produced mainly using featherback, which is a fish from the inland capture fishery, but that's being replaced increasingly by these farmed rohu, a kind of carp, and so it's becoming increasingly hard to find the fish balls made with the original freshwater fish. Next, please. But we also have other kinds of substitution taking place. So these pictures here are from Bangladesh, and this is showing a yard where fish is being processed. So fermented product is being produced in these jars that you can see in the large picture on the right, and that's made with dried fish that is then fermented. So the top left, you can see this is puti, again, this species that I've talked about from the inland fishery. And this is traditionally what has been used to make this, but increasingly, because it's getting so expensive, it's being replaced with the fish at the bottom, which is an anchovy that's dried on the coast and then brought inland. And so basically what's happening now is the puti is going to Dhaka, where better off consumers can eat it, and the anchovy fermented product is remaining in the north of Bangladesh, where consumers are poorer. And that's a less preferred product. Next slide, please. Okay, so moving to the marine sector, we also have increasing competition for low-cost small marine fish, and that's illustrated very nicely by these pictures here from Ayeyarwady in Myanmar on the coast. And the large picture on the left, this is a drying yard which has been established with through a Chinese investor. You can see it has a concrete floor. They have electric ovens for drying shrimp and fish, plastic baskets, a large workforce, and the fish is coming from this very large fleet of rafts which are anchored offshore. And basically the shrimp is being dried and exported direct to China. The fish is being exported to Yangon and consumed within Myanmar. And you can see it's boxed up in these cardboard boxes nicely on the floor. So just a few hundred meters down the beach, we have this very small scale artisanal fishing household. And basically because of the competition from the offshore rafts, there is less and less fish available for them to catch. And it's comprised mainly of these very small juvenile fish. And you can see here, any slightly larger fish are selected out and dried or fermented and used for food. And then these very small juvenile anchovies for which there's no market are dried and used for chicken or fish feed. Next slide, please. So here's another kind of competition. This is in Bangladesh. This is in one of the largest fish drying yards in Bangladesh, in Cox's Bazar. And this is what's sometimes referred to as trash fish. But rather than there being this sort of direct competition for food grade fish, here what's going for trash fish is basically fish that's been caught and been out at sea for several days at the bottom of the hold, and it's been crushed. It's starting to go bad. And also you can see in the top left-hand picture, lots and lots of very small crustaceans, like juvenile crabs for which there's no market. And you can see actually the man and the boy here are sorting through this pile of trash fish, pulling out anything that can be saved for human consumption and resold. So we have indirect competition for sort of fish biomass here. The food fish is still going for human consumption, but there's clearly lots of large biomass being removed from the ecosystem, lots of juvenile fish being removed from the ecosystem. So there's indirect competition. Next slide, please. Okay, so just to conclude, inland fisheries are being increasingly squeezed by habitat conversion, infrastructure development such as dams, climate change. This has all come together in Cambodia very recently, where there's been a huge decline in the productivity of the Tonle Sap fishery there. And as a result, many small fish from inland capture fisheries, which were once very cheap, are now increasingly expensive. So those are increasingly being replaced or substituted for by larger farm fish and small, less preferred marine fish. Small marine fish are still relatively low cost, but are experiencing heavy fishing pressure and greater competition, both from different categories of fisher. In some cases, direct competition for fish meal, and in other cases, some indirect competition for fish meal, as we've seen in the photographs. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Ben. I just want to remind everyone to put your questions in the Q&A box and we will address them later. Then I'd like to turn to our next presenter, Akosua Darkwah. If you could turn on your camera. Thank you very much. So Akosua is Associate Professor of Sociology and the current head of the Department of Sociology at the University of Ghana, where she has taught for the last 18 years. She holds a PhD in Development Sociology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her main research interest is in the interconnections between global policies, practices, and the local impacts of those. Much of her work has been on the gendered implications of global economic policies and practices for livelihoods in Ghana. In addition to her life as an academic, Akosua devotes time to the cause of women, serving as a deputy convener of the Network for Women's Rights, Ghana's leading women's rights organization. Her presentation is about exploring the enduring consumption of small pelagic fish in Jamestown, Ghana. Akosua, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be. So today I'm speaking on fish consumption in Jamestown, Ghana, a small coastal town or village, more likely. It's in the city though, so probably not a village, in the capital city of Ghana. Next slide, please. So here's the outline, why the interest in this project, and then how we went about doing it, and the findings, as well as explaining the food habits we discovered. And then I'll end with some policy implications. Next slide, please. So Ghana, unlike many other parts of the world, has quite a high fish consumption rate. We eat far more per capita than most people around the world. We are actually a full 20% more than the global average, consuming 25 kilograms per capita. And as has already been said about me, I'm particularly interested in the ways in which global policies, practices, attitudes affect what happens at the local level. So I was interested in seeing whether this was a more recent phenomenon or whether, given what was happening, these figures were going to start to look different over time. Next slide, please. So the way we thought to go about this was to use a qualitative method. I'm a qualitative sociologist, but we were interested in looking at two groups of people, younger people and older people. The idea being that that would allow us to track how food consumption practices had changed over time and give us a sense of whether things were changing on the ground with the younger generation now compared to the older generation. So we worked in Jamestown and we looked at 30 participants, 2 groups. They were more female than male because, in the field, it became very clear that consumers were thinking also about how the food was prepared and thinking that if we're talking about food, we should be talking to more women than men. So we really did make an effort to get males, but we didn't quite get half like we would have wanted. Next slide, please. So this is just an aerial view of the community. It's a low-income community. It's right across from the ocean. So on the left-hand side of this picture would be where the street known as High Street is, and then there's the lighthouse, and then there's the Atlantic Ocean. So this is a low-income community. Towards the end, I'll speak about what's happening in higher income communities, not scientifically, but perhaps because I live as a middle income Ghanaian and have a sense of what happens there. Next slide, please. So what did we find? Fish is the most consumed source of animal protein in what we call the Gamashi community, Jamestown. It's eaten with a cornmeal dish known as kenke, which you can see in the right-hand corner. And it's eaten with a tomato sauce, a fresh pepper and tomato and onion mix. The fish that's mostly consumed, as told to us by participants, were mackerels, sardinella, anchovies, and herrings. Next slide, please. So when we asked about what people would eat on a regular basis and why, here were some of the answers we got. And I want to highlight the difference in terms of age range to give you a sense of what different age groups were doing and what they were thinking. So an older woman says to us, if I have not eaten kenke, it means I've not eaten anything at all. So for her, during the day, whatever she did, she had to have a bowl of kenke. And the thing that's important to note about kenke is that you don't eat it with other kinds of things. You eat it with fish, preferably small pelagic fish. And so no matter how fancy the meal is going to be made, no matter how expensively put together it would be, because it's seen as a simple diet that comes together with the small pelagic fish, if she's eating kenke, then she's eating it with small fish. A younger woman says, can we go back, please? I eat kenke almost every day. As for the rest, they are just to clear the way. So for her as well, if she eats anything else, it's in preparation for the meal of kenke later on in the day. Thank you. Next slide. The other thing we wanted to note was whether there were changes for special occasions. So people might eat kenke and fish on a regular basis, but what happened for special occasions, and to what extent was that changing over time because of globalization? And so what we found was this: special occasions are the festivals, and then birthdays, Christmas, anniversaries, and so on. When it came to the annual festival, which is held in August every year, there's a dish that comes with fish, and that hasn't changed over time. So that gets eaten every year, and it includes fish. For birthdays, for holidays, for Christmas, rice and chicken was what's being consumed. But the interesting thing to note is that, contrary to what we thought, which was that rice and chicken for special occasions was a newer intervention, was a newer food habit being developed, what we found was that even the older generation referred to being young and being fed rice and chicken for special occasions. So, and I mean, we can have the argument that globalization has been happening all along, and therefore this is a process that has changed over time. And if we went back further enough, perhaps there would be no rice and chicken. But clearly what this shows is that in post-colonial Ghana, rice and chicken as something that you consumed on special occasions is at least 2 generations old. So the first person says, I mostly ate rice and chicken, and this person is 19. But when it was the festival, Homowo, then they ate pekple, and it is not complete without adding sea bream. Then the older man in his 60s says, in my days as a child, rice and chicken stew was what our mothers gave us during festive occasions or birthdays. But when it came to homowo, it was just quickly. Thank you. Next slide. And so then we said, okay, let's explain what's happening in terms of the food habits. What are the explanations that the consumers themselves are offering for why they eat so much kenkey with the fish? So for an older woman, she says, I carefully choose what I eat because of my age. And she explains that it takes too much effort to chew meat. So she had problems with her teeth and so on. She's had enough. But she also pointed out that fish promotes good health, especially for old people. And a number of the older people we spoke to talked about the fact that their doctors were advising them to continue to eat fish because that was better for their health. Next slide, please. Then here's the explanation that is linked to income levels. So this middle-aged man says, I eat fish because that's what I get. Meat is not something that I can afford. So for him, even if he wanted to consume meat, he couldn't afford it, so he wasn't opting for that. Next slide, please. Then here is the explanation that speaks to this point that I would like to emphasize, which is that eating kenkey is such a fundamental part of their diet, and that it goes with eating fish. So they eat the kenkey and then they eat the fish and they're not thinking too hard about it. So Koko, who's 25 younger, says, as for we the Ga, our umbilical cords were cut with maize, which is what is used to make the kenkey. And so for them during the day, no matter what happens, you have to have a meal with kenkey. If you have the meal with kenkey, fish is going to be part of what you end up consuming. Okay, next slide, please. So what then does this mean? Remember that this was a project that was based in a low-income community. And therefore, I was looking at what happens in communities where there isn't much to consume, much money to have a wide range of consumer choices. But what I do know is that also in Ghana, among middle and upper middle income communities, there are ways of encouraging fish consumption. So a couple of years ago, there was an architect who would basically turn a low-income community fish market into a what we call a night market event. It was held on Thursday nights, and there would be lights, there would be music. They would basically turn it into an interesting space, and the only food item available was fish and kenkey. So it afforded middle-income, upper middle-income Ghanaians an opportunity to go back to eating kenkey if they had forgotten about eating kenkey. And many other spaces do this. There are year groups who would have kenkey parties, they call it. So alumni get together and they do a party with just kenkey and different kinds of fish to go with it. So there are some things to learn from that in terms of ensuring that no matter what happens with higher incomes and so on, our interest in our traditional fish diets and doesn't change because of that. But the other thing is ensuring that we have fish, that the fish is accessible. And those who study this know more about this than I do. What for me was interesting to note was that in Jamestown right now, a harbor is being created right where the fishermen fish. And so in a number of years, that's going to have a huge impact on accessibility of fish in this community. And so we also need to think about what the ocean is available for and the different kinds of things that we do with it, so that while it is important to have other kinds of activities around our seafront and so on, we need to keep in mind that people have to eat, and the easier the accessibility is to fish, the more likely they are to consume or eat it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Akosua. Once again, I want to remind you that if you have any questions for Akosua, please put them in the Q&A box. And then I would like to turn to our next presenter, Amalendu Jyotishi. Yes, I see your camera's on, great. So Amal is a professor at the School of Development at Azim Premji University. His research work covers issues relating to natural resources and institutions from a development economics perspective. He's one of the core research members of the Asian Initiative on Legal Pluralism and was the coordinator of the group from 2012 to 2015. He was also an executive committee member of the Indian Society for Ecological Economics during 2018 and 2020. His current portfolio of research interests include fish for food security, dried fish value chains, and small-scale fisheries, on which he works as part of several international research projects. The work being presented here is part of the Fish for Food project. And his presentation is a tale of fish consumption in 2 Indian cities. Amal, please go ahead.
Thank you, Froukje. Good afternoon, good morning to everybody. So this is part of our Fish for Food project, a story from India side, a counterpart of Kyana. And in this, we are going to, we worked with several of our colleagues, and the story is about fish consumption in 2 cities, one coastal city, Chennai, and another inland city, Bangalore. And next slide, please. So I'll take you through why it is important to do this study in Indian context, particularly in city regions, and then how we went about doing this study, our survey approach and tools, and then some of the pertinent results that we got from our survey. I'll bring that out and then we'll kind of take some broader inferences and conclusion from this study. So next slide, please. So in Indian context, it's quite contrary to Kyana. What we have seen is that fish consumption generally has not appeared in the larger scheme of consumption stories. We had a tremendous amount of research around production and post-harvest. There are some aggregate information available about fish consumption, but very little that we know in how much fish being consumed, especially among the low-income group in the city regions. And given that India's performance in food and nutrition security is very low, we are one of the number 1 in terms of malnutrition, particularly stunting and wasting, and almost half of India's women are anemic. In that context, fish as a part of how important it is, role it plays in food and nutrition security was little known. And being a developing country with growing urbanization, this study then made a lot of importance. Next slide, please. So very contrary to Kyana, in India's per capita consumption, when we look at this FAO data, that India consumes about 5 kg of fish per person per year, which is very abysmally low, given that India produces quite a substantial amount of fish, both in aquaculture and through marine system. Next slide. So we had some data around at aggregate level, and it's very difficult given that fish is, or Indian communities are divided as vegetarian, non-vegetarian, and different communities eat vegetarian food, only eat vegetarian food. So it's getting a high level number of what is the proportion of people eat fish was not clearly available, but some of the data sources like the demographic health survey data, the last one in 2015-16, they did include fish as part of their survey, and we identified that almost about 65% of the Indian population, both in rural as well as in urban area, consume fish. And if we classify that by the wealth index, what we find is that the poorer prefer to eat more of fish, but they happen to eat it more occasionally rather than eating it frequently. So it is in this context that fish availability and affordability access becomes an important part of the story and narrative. Next slide. So why this study was so important is that we know very little about fish consumption, especially among the low-income households, and especially in the urban areas, because with the growing urbanization, a lot of people are flocking into the city regions, and most of them happen to be among the low-income group. And in urban areas, unlike in rural areas, more often fish or food access is through a process of a market. So it is just not consumption, but also the relationship with the market or trade, how it shapes up is also an important part of the story. And by design, we looked at a coastal city and an inland city, largely to see if both the type of city exhibit different kind of consumption behavior when it comes to fish consumption. Next one, please. So our study was based in two South Indian cities, Bangalore and Chennai, and we especially looked at low-income neighborhood, essentially the slum areas, and we, based on some kind of secondary data that was available on the slums, we tried to look at the neighborhoods which represents the cities in some spread, and in each neighborhood we chose about 30 respondents. So overall we had about 120 respondents per city. So that was one part of our sampling design. The other part of the design that we kept in mind is that fish being seasonal, particularly marine fish availability being seasonal, we also kept a seasonality aspect in mind, and hence conducted the survey in three seasons of the year, particularly keeping the monsoon ban period, pre-monsoon and post-monsoon as the three important periods of our survey. And a few other additional, next slide, please. Yes. Additional points that we had kept in mind is that how market plays an important role in this fish consumption behavior. Hence, in our sampling design, we consciously looked at settlements or slums which are closer to the marketplaces, as well as settlements which are far from the marketplaces. Some of the older settlements which had communities who have been living in the cities for a longer period of time, and a few new settlements where new entrants to the cities have been largely occupying. In Bangalore especially, we also looked at footloose communities, essentially the construction workers who are not living in any kind of permanent settlement, rather in the temporary settlement. So that's how our choice of neighborhood and sampling design was planned. Next slide, please. So as you would see, this green and blue dots are essentially in Bangalore, are closer to the two important city markets, fish markets, and the red and orange dots are essentially red is a settlement, new settlement, and orange dots are essentially the footloose communities in Bangalore that we studied. And coming to Chennai, next slide. Again, we looked at two locations which are closer to the important markets like Chindadripet and Saidapet, and two other locations which are far away from the market, including Chemancheri down in the which is a new settlement area far away from the marketplaces. So that's how our neighborhoods were selected, and from there we took the household as survey. Next slide. So we took up this study in 3 phases, and given that we went back to the same households in 3 rounds, we still had a remarkably high proportion of respondents returning back. We had very few dropouts, and with all that, we had about 732 observations from 256 households that we targeted. Yeah, next slide, please. So this is somewhat the demographic characteristics of the 2 cities. In our primary respondents were female because they make decision around the food consumption of the household, and hence we tried or attempted to interact with them. In few cases, there are male members who are available. In Bangalore, particularly, we are seeing a larger number of male members. These are coming largely from the footloose communities, where a lot of these construction workers don't live with the households. The entire household doesn't stay there. Rather, they come alone and kind of work in the city region. So hence, we had a higher number of male representation in Bangalore. In terms of ethnicity or language they speak, in Chennai, it's largely the Tamil spoken population. In Bangalore, you will find a good number of them identify themselves as Hindi or Urdu speaking, but it should not be confused with that, because a large number of them are essentially from Muslim communities who prefer to identify themselves with Hindi or Urdu speaking instead of Kannada, which is the native language here, but they are all fluent in speaking in Kannada. But Bangalore also is a host to a good number of Tamil communities. Hence, Bangalore showed a little more, in our sample, we had more diversity in terms of the linguistic background. Next slide. The demographic, in terms of income levels, you will find that in Bangalore, it is the third black bar in the left-hand side is higher, which is about 10,000 to 20,000 rupees as the income bracket the low-income consumers, low-income households belong to. But in Chennai, the household income is somewhere between 5,000 to 10,000 rupees. And in Bangalore also, it is tend to be a little higher, because the women also take up additional work as household services or maid services, and hence in many of the household cases there are double income, and which also tends to give them a higher income. So Bangalore's general income level was higher than Chennai's income level. Next. So coming to for the preferences of fish and why they eat what kind of fish, we had these two groups of questions associated with freshwater fish consumption and marine fish consumption. What is interestingly that comes out is Chennai as a city has a high non-preference for freshwater fishes, whereas Bangalore low-income consumer consume both freshwater as well as marine fishes. But why they make this kind of choices? What comes out very clearly is that both the households from both the cities associate marine fishes with good health and nutrition, whereas the freshwater fish is associated with it is cheaper or it is tasty. So, that's one of the first contrasts that comes out between these two cities. Yeah, next slide, please. What kind of fish people of low-income households of these two cities prefer? So, in Bangalore, the general preference goes to mackerel and sardine as the two preferred fish. These are the small pelagic fishes, which is largely preferred by the households. And whenever the availability of these fishes are low, these are also substituted by varieties of freshwater fishes like carps, like tilapia, rohu, and kakla. These are the kind of fish they consume. Whereas when it comes to Chennai, the preference for fish is threadfin bream, or their locally it is known as sankara. That is the kind of fish the Chennai consumer prefer. And when its availability is less, it is substituted by varieties of other marine fishes. And the freshwater fish doesn't come into picture for the Chennai's consumers. And remember, Chennai is a coastal city and Bangalore is an inland city. Yes, next. How frequently they consume fish. So what came out from our survey was that Chennai's consumers prefer more of marine fishes, not only more of marine fishes, but also they consume fishes more often. They consume almost 2 to 4 times a week. Whereas when it comes to Bangalore consumer, you find that they consume less frequently. They consume fish less frequently, and you could also see that there is an indifference between fresh and dried fish. They switch between freshwater fishes and marine fishes. Dried fish as a part of the consumption, though infrequent, it is part of the tradition of consumption in both the cities, but more so in Bangalore compared to in Chennai. Yeah, next. So how much money they spend for fish and how much fish they buy. So if you would see the graph in the left-hand side, though it is not clearly visible, the longish bars are essentially representing 1 kg of fish. In one go, when they go to buy fish, they prefer to buy 1 kg of fish. What you do see is that there is a tremendous amount of consistency of buying 1 kg fish by the Bangalore consumer, whereas in Chennai consumer, you would see that in different rounds, sometimes they buy more fish. In some seasons, they buy more fish. In some other seasons, they buy less fish. But generally, they prefer to buy 1 kg of fish. When coming to the right-hand side of the graph that you will see is that in Bangalore, the longish bar essentially represents the fish they buy is at somewhere price between 100 to 200 rupees. And it's fairly consistent. The prices are high. In Chennai, you would see the longish bar are essentially representing 50 to 100 rupees. And so the Chennai fish is reasonably cheaper compared to the fish prices in Bangalore. Also, you see that there is a variation of fish prices that happens in Chennai, in the coastal city, whereas the price variations are lower in Bangalore. But we should also recollect and remember that Bangalore's the general income level is also higher compared to the income level in Chennai. So even if the prices are relatively higher, it has to be looked at on the basis of how much income these households are. Next slide, please. We asked questions around availability, affordability, quality, and stability, essentially the 4 dimensions of food security. And we are expecting or hypothesizing that possibly this household should come up to say the availability of fish would be a problem, access to fish would be a problem. But what was surprising for us is that most of the households across the cities, they found that good quality fishes at affordable price is available throughout the year. Though their degree may vary slightly, but generally they didn't complain about availability of affordable quality fish throughout the year. Yeah. And knowing that city regions depend on market for fish consumption purpose, so we also wanted to explore what kind of relationship they share with the market and from which are their preferred markets for buying fish. In both the cities, what we found is that mobile vendors and nearby local markets constitute the major part of their fish purchasing activities. In Chennai, it is the mobile vendors who are critical in bringing fish to this low-income household. And we should also recollect, and maybe in the next session, when Holly and Vivek, they are talking about it, we'll get to know more about these mobile vendors. More often, these mobile vendors are women, and they carry a headload of fish. They go to these locations to sell their fishes. And whereas in Bangalore, there is a conspicuous absence of women in the fish trading activities. And most of these mobile vendors come in bikes or cycles to these areas. Otherwise, there are nearby local markets where there are sedentary shops to which these consumers go and buy their fish. So in that sense, there is some amount of contrast between both the cities where Bangalore consumers prefer to buy from the nearby local market and the Chennai consumers prefer to buy from the mobile vendors who more often are women. Next. And it is just not buying fish from the mobile vendors, but also there is a credit relationship they share with the traders. So quite often or more often a large number of Chennai consumers buy fish on credit from these vendors, whereas the transactions are a lot more formal in Bangalore. Next slide. And very interestingly, when we asked about where you get the best quality fishes and worst quality fishes, the responses that came from Chennai is that they said that the nearby local market where they get best quality as well as the worst quality fishes. What is interesting about here is that Bangalore low-income consumers saw some amount of aspiration from the supermarkets. That supermarkets provide a good quality of fish. So yeah, so next slide, please. So from these two cities, what we essentially get to know is that the Chennai consumers saw a specific preference towards marine fishes and non-preference towards the freshwater fishes, and fish prices are relatively higher in Bangalore compared to in Chennai. There is a seasonal variation that we get in terms of fish availability in Chennai compared to in Bangalore, where the fish availability seems to be much more consistent. Next slide. And consumer of both the city perceive quality fish is available, and affordable quality fish is available throughout the year. And mobile vendors play an important role in that. Is an important link between fish and the poor in both the cities, but especially in Chennai. And Chennai's consumer exhibit a kind of a socially embedded relationship when it comes to fish, their preferences, their choice of fishes, and the relationship they share with the trader exhibits a strong social embeddedness in their consumption behavior, where Bangalore shows some amount of formal relationship with the trade and market. And keeping that in mind, it is important that when we are looking at different kinds of cities, particularly inland cities and coastal cities, this is one aspect that has to be kept in mind, that the commodification of fish may not work in the same way in a traditional coastal cities vis-a-vis a inland city. And a more formalization as a process may not be appropriate while designing some kind of policies while taking fish to the poor consumer. So with that, I will, next slide. Yeah, with that, I'll end my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amal. Our next presenter is Kiana De Pananda. Yes, there she is. So Kyana is a PhD student at the University of Amsterdam. She joined the Amsterdam Institute for Social Science Research and worked with two departments, anthropology and governance and inclusive development. Before starting her doctoral trajectory in 2019, Kyana attended Wageningen University in Research for her master's degree, where she focused on issues of coastal communities, human geography, and the socioeconomics aspects of fisheries. From her experience studying marine issues, she developed a strong interest to further study fish chains. Through the NWO-funded project Innovative Knowledge About Networks, Fish for Food, or ICAN F3, she is now researching fish in food systems, looking at the Fish Consumer Agency in hinterland Madura. Her study lies on the intersection of food politics, gender, and the informal networks of fish traders. And she will be presenting on eating fish in rural Madura, Indonesia, access, practices, and perceptions. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Froukje. Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me clearly. As one of the PhD students from ICAN F2 project, I would like to take this opportunity to talk to you about eating fish from rural consumer point of view and how it helps us further understand the issues on accessibility, consumption practices, and perception that influence the consumer preference in fish consumption. Next, please. Let me start with some general information on my research area. So Madura is an Indonesian island off the northeastern coast of Java. So administratively, Madura is part of the province of East Java. But unlike Java, the soil is not fertile enough to make it a major agricultural provider. Limited economic opportunities have led to chronic unemployment and poverty. And Sumeneb, where I work, is one of the poorest regencies of the East Java province. However, Sumeneb has high fishery potential due to its long coastline. The fisheries activities also contribute a lot of livelihoods in the form of economic activities and food sources for the people there. If we look into the picture on the right side, we can see the circle with lines. That was my fieldwork area. Location-wise, it is a village that has 5 hamlets with different geographic traits. There is one coastal hamlet, one hinterland hamlet, and there are other hamlets in between those two. I put a few marks on the local market and the line that indicates the fish flow, which are coming in from the north and southern part of Sumeneb, depending on the season. Next, please. So I conducted a fieldwork in the village, but I didn't start there. I started in one of the local market where I met my main interlocutor. She is the one with red helmet and mask. She is the woman mobile trader selling perishable food items, including fish. She is the one who brought me to Andulang village as I traveled with her for a month to 7-8 village, meeting her customers, which happens to be my interlocutors too. Later, I decided to stay in one of the village to join the everyday activities there and to know the rural fish consumers better. In doing so, I had a semi-structured interviews with 50 households. I did participant observation and maintained contact with 20 households as I continue my fieldwork. As a disclaimer, at the beginning of my research, I didn't expect that most of my informants are women. However, my interview list has quickly turned into all women names because every time I visit a house and start asking about kitchen activities or food-related topic, all men turn their heads to the women and quickly disappear from my sites. So not to mention that most of the fish traders are also women too. It is obvious that the more I travel away from the sea, the more often I find women in the fish food system. And it is not just as the women are essential to the fish food system, but they're also exposed to multiple roles and in the system starting from the pre-harvest, post-harvest, fish retailing, and feeding the family. Next, please. So the findings are interesting. First and foremost, fish is embedded in daily diets and constantly present in Madura's everyday menu. Fish is everyday food for the Sumeneb community, and it is always present in one form or another in every kitchen as a source of staple protein. A plate of milled corn mixed with white rice and a piece of boiled fish is the typical everyday food that is feeding the community. Speaking of fish farm, the fish processing practices have been sustained for decades through local knowledge of the Madurese community, and the processed fish is consumed widely there. There are boiled fish, smoked fish, dried fish, salted fish, and even fish paste to be added as a flavor enhancement. Fish eaten fresh is common in coastal households, but the more we move away from the sea, processed fish is usually the choice of this household. What is popularly consumed is fish that is processed by boiling. Well, that's about it for this part. We've covered the fact that fish is commonly consumed in rural Madura and there are different forms of it. But I want to know more about how do they access the fish, why the fish consumers choose that fish, and what are their perceptions about the fish that they eat. This leads us to my next point, where I want to use 3 words that I noticed being repeatedly used by my interlocutors in explaining their views about fish as foods. Those 3 words are cheap, healthy, and tasty. By bringing the local understanding about fish, these 3 words have been helpful to me in discovering food preference and practices among fish consumers in rural Madura. Next, please. Okay, so cheap fish. When I was asking around what is the cheap fish, I always got the same answer. It depends on the season. So seasonality plays a big part in accessing affordable fish. Most of the fishers in Madura is the small-scale fishers that the fishing activities is dependent on the season. Special to the village where I stay, the seasonal fluctuations affect fish landing and further influence the seasonal trade network serving the Andulang community. On the dry season, most of the fishers stay up north and landed their fish there. Meanwhile, on the rainy season, the fishermen need a place to dock their boat in somewhere safe to avoid the storm. That is when they land their fish in southern part of Sumeneb near the village where I stay. Many of the seasonal fish traders living nearby the landing site benefited from this situation. The fish becomes cheaper because stocks are overflowing to the village. It is not just the fish supply that matters, the seasonality also influences the livelihood. So rural community work follows the rhythm of the season. With various types of the livelihoods, there are some people who benefit from certain season and some are even more difficult. With the fluctuation of seasons and income, fish consumption becomes erratic. Understanding the impact of seasonality is essential to understand the access to fish, as the number of people involved in processing and marketing continues to grow in the village. Aside from the seasonality, the quality of fish also matters when it comes to understanding affordability. Many of the women I spoke, they said that the cheap fish are the fish that is deteriorated or defective. I will further elaborate on the fish quality in the next slide when we discuss healthy fish. Next, please. So, healthy fish. The literal translation from Madhuri's words is actually not healthy fish, but more like the fish that is good to eat. In general, fish is considered healthy and a must-eat in Sumeneb. These words are quoted from one of my interlocutors that shows how locally embedded fish are to Madhuri's diets. If I do not eat fish, my body feels drowned. But my next question is, what kind of fish? What kind of fish do the rural consumers in Madura choose to eat? This is where I discovered that the fish that is good to eat, speaking about size and quality. For lower class consumers, healthy means a longer feeling of fullness. So size matters. They tend to pick the fish based on how much meat is there, and without really caring about the quality of the fish. A little not fresh is okay for them. So the important thing is that it's edible. That is what they said. However, the degree of edibility is different among consumers. And I found that the higher class consumers care about quality and tend to not eat fish if the quality is not meeting their standards. So egg or tofu often becomes the substitute. They have a tendency not to buy the fish immediately if there are signs that it's not fresh. The third point, speaking about freshness, fish with ice is considered not healthy. Fish traders do not want to sell their fish with ice because customers do not want to buy fish that has been iced. They refuse the idea of frozen fish or fish that is stored with ice because it's an indication of yesterday fish, like fish from a few days ago. This is an issue when it comes to the distribution process here in the village because from the moment the fish was put in a basket in the back of the mobile trader's motorcycle, the quality and freshness of the fish has decreased. And a consumer who lives the farthest away from the market and are visited in the afternoon will usually get the fish of the worst quality. Although oftentimes when the traders got to their place, the fish was already gone. So here I wanted to say that freshness and edibleness is never final and debatable. Next, please. Turning our attention now to the tasty fish. I realized that during my interaction with the rural consumers, I found that taste matters. But taste is also a tricky component to study. Based on my finding, taste is developed from social class, memories, and mobilities. There are a few examples here. I will walk you one by one through it. So remember when I mentioned about the poor distribution process and no eye situation? I found that some of the lower class consumers develop a distinctive taste for the poor quality of fish, like the rotten fish. In the picture, you can see that one of my interlocutors showing me the almost rotten fish that is already cooked with yellow spices. So it's contained of turmeric, ginger, garlic, salt, and pepper. Spices play an important part in developing a distinctive taste for fish in Madura. Many of the people specifically look for the almost rotten fish or even make one from the fresh fish by leaving it outside the house to make it rotten. I guess it's kind of like fermented. Turns out that this kind of fish brings back memories of childhood because they learn to eat this type of fish from their parents, although many of younger generation doesn't like this type of fish. Speaking about how parents influence the formation of taste, I found that there is a tendency for the moment to give the children eggs or tofu and not fish because the mothers doesn't have time to separate the bones from the flesh. In this case, they revert to a type of fish like sardines, Indian mackerels, or mullets or milkfish that has many bones. So many women I spoke with, they told me that their children grew up not liking fish because they do not get used to the fish smells and they find it difficult to eat. So the next point is the growing up, the seasonal migrations to Jakarta. So growing up and temporarily moved from Madura, many of young generations has changing preference on food. It is a common phenomenon in rural Madura that the young people usually work in big cities as a seasonal workers. They usually become a shopkeeper in Jakarta, for example. And during my interactions with some of them in the village, I found that they have a desire to eat foods that they often encounter in big cities, such as meatballs, instant noodles, and other processing food. Snacks also become a necessity rather than a food that is occasionally eaten. And then last point in this slide, I found it very interesting view on the deliciousness that comes from the origins of the fish. During my field work, I encounter fish consumers and fish traders. Their interaction creates a social dynamics that make them exchange knowledge on what is a tasty fish. But it seems that there is a common consensus, beliefs by the rural Madurese community on the boiled fish that is coming from certain village in the northern part of the Sumeneb. They said that the tastiest boiled fish coming from a village called Slopeng. Regardless of the truth of the claim, what is interesting is how the traders compete to sell their fish with the assurance that their fish they bring comes from this area, although we don't know whether it's true or not. So next, please. In conclusion, let me sum up my main points from this presentation. There is diversity in understanding fish as food. Rural markets were not homogeneous, and that rural fish consumers behave differently. Food preference and fish consumption practices in rural Madura are influenced by seasonality, economic livelihood, social relationship between fish traders and consumers, household dynamics, and personal taste. I see that opportunities emerge from the resilience of local and informal trade networks that's serving the rural community for years. However, there are several threats occur, such as increased climatological instability, poor handling and distribution process, and changing consumption pattern. It should be emphasized again here that the local knowledge matters in understanding consumer preferences. Understand their language to know why they eat the food that they eat. Consumer must be the focal point here. And then that brings me to the end of my presentation. It was my pleasure being here today. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Kiana. Our next presenter is Thijs Schut. Thijs, can you turn on your camera? Thank you. Thijs is an anthropologist at the University of Amsterdam, working mainly in East Indonesia. Currently, he's a postdoc in the Ikan F3 project, studying the intersections between fish traders and their networks, consumption patterns, and government policies on the island of Sumba. His presentation, as you'll see here, is policy blind spots and the contested nature of small low-cost fish consumption in rural Indonesia. Thijs, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much, Froukje. So today I will present on ongoing research from Indonesia, which is being conducted by Gerben Notenboom, Masmada Kutanagara, Roosje van Driest, and myself within the Ikan F3 research project. And what we will be doing today is to combine some ethnographic data on local foodways with a critical policy approach. Next slide, please. And we will be arguing that despite their valuable contributions to rural poor people's livelihoods and food and nutrition security, small low-cost fish remain largely policy blind spots in Indonesia. There is a historical reflex to think in terms of technocratic approaches to food production, which have informed this a policy bias towards local conceptions of high-value fish. And this is not an innocent bias. Using the East Indonesian island of Sumba as principal case, we argue that it contests local foodways and fish preferences, challenging healthy diets. Next slide, please. So let me first take you to Sumba, an island in southeast Indonesia. I've put a circle on it. The red dots represent other research locations of our project. Now, Sumba is one of the poorest islands of the nation. Large parts of the population live in villages where people rely on agriculture, cultivating mostly rice and maize. The private sector is small in Sumba, and for wage work, most people rely on government-supported jobs, which are limited. Sumba is subject to long, dry spells, due to which agricultural gains are limited and seasonal, also because not much land is irrigated. And as a result, people regularly cut back on food to survive periods of food shortages. Sumba people are vulnerable to food insecurity, illustrated by high levels of malnourishment, especially among children. Next slide, please. Now, on the right, you see a picture of what people in most parts of inland rural Sumba consider to be a good meal. Rice is staple and central to the food experience, and it is complemented mostly with a bit of vegetables, sometimes an egg or some fried tofu, or as on this picture, some fried fish, in this case, ikan tembang, a sardine-like fish. It is popular due to its taste, but also because it's caught locally, often available, and easy to share because for a limited price, families can buy enough to provide 1 or 2 fish to each member. They are often fried and consumed as a whole, except for its guts and gills. Rural people in Zumba like to eat fresh, wild-caught fish like these sardines. When families have access to it and they have the money to buy it, I found that they tend to eat fish 2 or 3 times a week. In Zumba, people are less fond of farmed fish. They often dislike its taste and associate it with sewage, as people feel that when they defecate, it ends up in ponds where fish is taken from. They also don't eat much dried fish, as it is not widely available. Due to seasonality, in some areas, fish is dried in times of high yields, but fish is mostly straight away dispersed through fine mesh trade networks. There's also very little processing of fish in Zumba. For example, in East Zumba, I'm aware of only 1 village where they smoke fish, but it's considered to be a local delicacy and sold in close proximity of the production site only. Next slide, please. So ikan tembang and other small low-cost fish are sold to inland communities through fine mesh network of mobile traders, mostly males who venture out on motorbikes. These traders maintain relatively short value chains between the coast and the rural hinterland. Artisanal fisherfolk, who often go out in unmotorized small wooden boats alone or in pairs, are important suppliers to these traders. Bigger motorized boats with crews up to 10 people are not common beyond a few ports. These boats sell their fish mainly to middlemen in a few large towns, who distribute it mostly in these towns itself or through mobile traders to the hinterland. The fish distributed this way takes longer to reach the rural villages, and with limited storage facilities and fish mainly kept in foam boxes on ice, the fish becomes of a quality that is less than the fish distributed through the short value chain of the artisanal fisheries. This is also because it is often the inexperienced and new traders that have to approach town-based middlemen, as they often haven't got the connections with the artisanal fisherfolk. These new traders also lack established routes with regular customers and compete with fish traders that are known for the fresh ware. And as a result, they often get stuck with fish that they try to sell day after day. When supply is high, it is said that some traders sell fish that has died already 10 times. There seems to be a general distrust in the quality of fish. And as Kyana mentioned, buying fish involves a careful inspection based on situated knowledge. Consumption of fish is, as in most other places, limited by 2 related factors: seasonality and purchasing power. Some months, fish like ikan tembang are difficult to catch due to high waves, or they have migrated. And as a result, prices go up and mobile traders either don't have fish to sell any longer, or they remain in town as their higher prices prohibit impoverished rural people to buy fish. In other months, especially from October till December or January, when crops can't yet be planted due to the absence of rain and the harvest from the previous season is almost gone, people are low on cash money and they often refrain from buying fish. People call it the hunger season. Next slide, please. So given this hunger season, which is common throughout rural Indonesia, it makes sense that governments at all levels, from the national to the local, have policies to prevent hunger and malnutrition. The thing is, however, that small, low-cost fish do not feature much in these policies. Now, this is a problem in itself, as these fish are high in important nutrients and could prevent malnutrition. But even more so, this blind spot challenges existing foodways and taste preferences. Let me explain. So in Indonesia, as in many other post-colonial states, there's a long history of technological approaches to development. Without going into an analysis of the historical roots of these approaches, it was especially during the reign of President Suharto from 1965 until 1998 that a modernization discourse got hold of the nation. The state took it upon itself to develop and modernize the country, which provided the regime with an air of legitimacy. And until today, these efforts resonate in official policies, daily discourses, and general ideas about modernity. And an important aspect of these general ideas is an overt belief in the capacity of technologies to fix things. For example, hunger and malnutrition, recurring problems in Indonesia's history, are often dealt with through large-scale interventions, including those associated with the Green Revolution, such as the introduction of new seed varieties for rice, the creation of large-scale farms, and the training of new experts who perpetuate the belief in technological solutions. Now, by means of technocratic approaches to food as a basis for political legitimacy, there is a strong belief in increasing availability of food, particularly carbohydrates like rice. Even today, industrialized rice farms are imagined in policy circles as necessary to provide a national demand for rice. But such imagination has come at a cost. That is, technological advances in food production have become equated with modernity, while previous foodways, particularly on Indonesia's outer islands, have become equated with tradition and framed as a field of intervention. And as a result, the production of, for example, beans, wild rice varieties, and drought-resistant grains have all been pushed to the margin, with in many cases less nutritious diets as a result. There's a taste for modernity in Indonesia. We can see it in other developments as well, including the rise of instant foods that increasingly take up large chunks of people's food budgets. Their popularity is pushed for by government policies, making them part of food protection programs. Fish have never been part of such programs, neither are they included much in the latest COVID-19 support packages. Next slide, please. So when looking specifically at fish policies in Indonesia, we recognize the technological and production-minded focus from food policies in general. There's a high value fish bias, which has a double meaning. First, in Indonesia, fish is mainly seen as an economic asset where the fisheries sector is considered an important contributor to GDP, with seas seen as untapped resource, even though in some parts overexploitation is a real concern. Locally caught fish through small-scale artisanal methods, like in Zumba, are not included in this vision. Second, high value is associated with technological interventions aimed at increasing production and availability. Though recent government programs have advocated fish consumption in Indonesia, historical trends are favoring a production and availability mindset through promoting motorized boats, sophisticated gears, and technological knowledge, also about aquaculture. Now, of course, there's nothing wrong with stimulating availability of fish in Indonesia per se, but modernization discourses have a discursive effect. They make the not so modern either subject to an intervention or it becomes neglected. Now, of course, government demands, consumer demands are affected by forces such as globalization, rising incomes, and demographic developments. But in a country where a modernization discourse is anchored in collective ideas about what constitutes progress and what constitutes backwardness, especially on islands like Sumba, which are imagined as out-of-the-way places, we should be careful to nurture local preferences for good, locally caught fish. And it seems that this is not happening. And I'll give you a few examples. So first, marine policies on Sumba heavily favor aquaculture, though it takes up only a fraction of the current fish harvest. Though it could make sense to expand aquacultures, it doesn't take into account locally appropriate preferences, knowledge, and mechanisms of access. Moreover, there are debates whether the nutritious value of farmed fish is on par with that from small wild-caught fish. The exclusion of fish from local food support programs is problematic too, not only because it means the exclusion of highly nutritious foodstuff, but also because these programs directly affect people's diet, due to which they might not buy fish any longer and divert funds into instant foods and prefabricated snacks. A few years back, the then Minister of Fisheries, Ibu Susi, provided a number of what local people called big motorized boats for crews up to 10 people. It has met with many issues, including corruption, mismanagement, and a mismatch with local conditions. But we should also note that these boats compete directly with the small wooden boats from artisanal fisherfolk who feed into the short value chains that provide fresh fish to the hinterlands. And finally, despite decades of decentralization policies in Indonesia, centralized ideas about food and nutrition dominate local agendas as the upper echelons of bureaucracies and the education system in Sumba are mostly trained in Java. And it is these ideas which are associated with modernity that do not match local experiences and preferences, as the focus on aquaculture attests. And this observation raises questions about who is initiating policies, on what kind of knowledge, and the political tensions inherent to these projects. Next slide, please. So we argue that local conceptions of the good meal should be central to any intervention. And this may sound obvious, yet still there are policy blind spots for the delicate nature of small, low-cost fish consumption and its access mechanisms. Foodways in impoverished rural areas are largely neglected, mostly because they do not fit a policy concept of high value in Indonesia, which neglects the non-monetary value of small fish. And when we draw parallels between the persistent focus on the availability of carbohydrates on the one hand, and how it has pushed previously common foodstuff to the margin, and fish policies on the other hand, we note that small low-cost fish might equally be pushed away, eroding fish preferences and consumers' options, and thus challenging healthy diets. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thijs. So that concludes the presentations. Please go ahead and write any questions that you still have in the Q&A. We will get to them shortly. I'd like to invite all panelists to switch their cameras on. Sharon, you can also remove the slides. But before we go into the questions, we have a small intermezzo. I just want to see, to test the temperature basically among the attendees. So I have a small poll for you with 3 questions or 3 statements actually that you can choose to agree to, disagree, or say that you're not able to decide. You can just click on your preferences and I will then launch the results shortly. Apologies, panelists. I see that I didn't allow you to vote, but keep your vote in mind because I will ask you for it in a minute. So the first statement is promoting fish consumption is the basis. Value chains will follow if consumers demand products. The second statement is policymakers are the most important actors in ensuring small fish is part of people's diets. And the third statement is promoting small fish in formal market channels is an efficient way for consumers to access small fish at an affordable price. So I see the votes coming in now. I'll give it another minute or so. Okay, I have 35 votes. Oh, now it's going up quickly. Just if you have trouble finding the submit button, you should scroll, make sure that you scroll down. All right, I'll give it 5 more seconds. Okay, I'll launch the results. You should be able to see this now. No, not yet. Yes, you should be able to see this now. So promoting fish consumption is the basis. Value chains will follow if consumers demand products. And 74% of you agrees with that statement. There are also quite a few that don't feel able to decide. The second statement, policymakers are the most important actors in ensuring small fish is part of people's diets. there people disagree, the majority, 43%, but also 30% agree. So this is an interesting point for discussion for the panel, I think. But also 26% says, I'm not sure. And finally, promoting small fish in formal market channels is an efficient way for consumers to access small fish at an affordable price. And note here that the word was formal market channels. And we see that 61% agrees here. So I'm imagining that some of the panel members will also have something to say about that. So I will stop sharing the results, and perhaps I can give the floor first to you, Ben, and to respond to one of the statements. I would say start with the first one. So promoting fish consumption is the basis value chains will follow if consumers demand products. What would you have voted there if you had been able to?
Thanks, Froukje. Sort of no, I think. I mean, definitely value chains are the basis of moving product to consumers. No argument there. I'm not sure that consumption really needs to be promoted, though. You know, in all of the places that we're talking about, clearly there's a lot of unmet demand probably for fish. And so, you know, why do we need to be externally playing this role in encouraging people to eat it? If people have access to it and they have the money to buy it, then they will consume it most of the time.
All right, thanks. Perhaps is any of the panel members in disagreement with what Ben was saying? Then no. Okay, then I'll ask you about the second statement. Policymakers are the most important actors in ensuring small fish is part of people's diets. Akosua, would you like to say something about that?
Okay, so my answer is probably not going to be the one people would like to hear, but I think that we give too much credit to policymakers from where I sit. Policy is important, but you need to translate it into implementation and action. And often I think the emphasis is on getting the policy right, with an assumption that once we have the policy, everything else follows. And I'm not quite sure it's that simple, at least from where I sit. I think many more issues have to be thought about and thought through beyond just the policy being made. Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much, Akosua. Thijs, given your statements about policymakers, would you also like to respond to this statement?
Yeah, well, I kind of, I'm online with what Akosua is saying, that I'm not sure whether they have that power to positively impact on consumption. In fact, as I have argued, I say that in many ways they sort of contest this local consumption patterns. For this statement, my answer would have been not too sure about it. So yeah.
Kyana, I see you nodding. Would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I'm actually was just thinking that I'm choosing, I'm not able to decide, because in my opinion, policymaker might be the one that needs to ensure if small fish is part of people's diets. I think they need to ensure that the people have access to it or help them to access it, but they're not the one who can decide whether small fish is a part of their diet or not, because back to my presentations, I think consumers is a focal point here, and they are the one who needs to decide whether they want to eat the small fish or big fish or any other kind of food. Consumer preference still matters, in my opinion.
Okay, thanks. And while I have you then, could you also respond to the third statement, promoting small fish in formal market channels is an efficient way for consumers to access small fish at an affordable price?
Yeah, I vote disagree, because in my findings in my fieldwork area, I think informal market channels is already efficient and resilient enough. Although I realize that every market channels in every place is contextual, and it cannot be, I cannot say for all, but in my point of view, in my area, informal market channels is already working in an efficient way, especially during COVID-19. I see that there's a lot of resilience towards the fish traders, and also they are flexible enough to go in and out in the market channels. And I just wanted to add that Martin here remind us that don't forget that policymakers are not only government, but can belong to civil society and user groups.
Yeah. Amal, I'm guessing you will also have something to say about the formal market channels.
Yes. Yeah. In fact, that is one question that I would incline to disagree compared to other two, where I would be having a mixed feeling. It's largely because when it comes to food security, at least we figured out in part of this study as well as many other studies that this informal channels play an important role between connecting fish with the poor. And in fact, these informal channels themselves are precarious. They are not that they have a strong collective or strong position in the marketplace, but they still play a very critical role in kind of connecting fish with the poor. And in fact, if you turn it around to go towards more formal process, what we have been seeing is that more formalization and more economies of scale is kind of bringing in different kinds of dispositions that in the ecological degradation that they would be doing in the marine ecosystem, or the displacement of livelihood that would be doing for the people who are engaged in the processing activity. And of course, in terms of consumption, how it channelized like fish meal going to shrimp farms and then getting exported, and the small fishes being the victim of it, and the poor being the victim of it, having access to that. So this is one question. At least I would be a lot more clear by saying that the informal processes are a lot more resilient, and in fact, we have to find ways to promote that rather than bringing formalization as a process of change.
Thanks very much, Amal. I'm also seeing some comments in the chat, and feel free for others if you'd like to clarify what you voted also to do that in the chat. So I see Martin is saying about the first statement, if there is no fish of certain species being harvested anymore, consumption habits will change. Regardless of how well the value chain functions. And Kafayat is also agreeing with the idea that we give too much credit to policymakers, but she thinks that policies could be more instrumental to improve investments that enhance small-scale fisheries, inclusive of small fish. Okay, anyone else that would like, of the attendees that would like to say something about how they voted in the chat, please feel free. If not, I will turn to the questions that were being posed in the Q&A, and I see some of them have already been answered by the panelists in writing, but perhaps it would be nice if you could add a bit to that. So there was, so first I'll turn to you, Ben. There was a question about the development of more conventional fish meal and oil production in Myanmar and Bangladesh based on small marine fish, from Dave Little.
Yes, so in Myanmar, in the far south of Myanmar in Tanantari, there is a small number of fish meal plants, but there's actually a reduction fishery. But that would account for really quite a small proportion of the total. I mean, in all of the rest of the country, as far as I know, in the marine fisheries, all of the marine fish is going for human consumption. And in Bangladesh, to the best of my knowledge, there's no sort of kind of industrial scale fish meal production.
Okay, thanks. And there was also a question from Jeppe Kolding on why you think that cultured fish are becoming more preferable to consumers than wild fish. Is this because of the size, taste, availability, price, or anything else?
So there's a couple of factors I would say. Yeah, the first one is availability and price. So particularly freshwater fish, but some marine fish too are becoming difficult to find at a price that people can afford. And so farmed fish are now, at least the ones that are sort of mass produced are actually considerably cheaper. Quite often for people who have kind of grown up eating wild fish, that's their preference. But actually with urbanization, you sort of have, generation of people who grew up in the cities, maybe not familiar with these diverse species of fish, and they may actually prefer fish that has fewer bones in it. And perhaps we know see in Myanmar from some of the work Xavier Tezo has been doing, sort of changing preferences. So the way that people live their lives, they're much busier. They're eating sort of fried fish, for instance, rather than taking the time to make curries. And so it's a fried tilapia is for instance, is maybe more appropriate than something else that would go in a curry. So it's a kind of mixture of two things.
Thanks very much. So that actually brings me to a question to you, Thijs, because this point of changing food preferences, and you were highlighting how certain policies for food security may have an adverse effect, but it seems like from what Ben is saying that actually these trends are there anyway. So how do you see that?
Yes, I think you're absolutely right, Froukje. And I sort of copied your words from the introduction in my presentation that demographic changes, rise of income, and also ideas about modernity affect consumption. Still, we need to remember that in many, many places around the world, people have still very limited resources to actually put those ideas of modernity into practice, and they sort of still need to eat the very basic kind of food stuff, including rice, just a bit of cooked vegetables, and yeah, well, occasionally an egg, some tofu or fish. And though urbanization, for example, takes up a lot of place on development agendas, I think that people in places like Sumba and in many other islands in Indonesia are sort of becoming forgotten a bit. And we need to stress that their consumption patterns do not fit these ideas of modernity. Well, yeah. So it's really important to keep in mind that a lot of people cannot sort of go along with these changes, and they still rely on this basic food stuff.
Okay, thanks very much, Thijs. Akosua, your presentation highlighted how food preferences continue to exist, but I was wondering, with kenke, obviously it's very important what happens to the price of maize. So what would you imagine happens? Imagine that the prices of maize shoot up for some reason because of climate change. No production. The production becomes less. Would that then also have an impact on the consumption of fish because it's associated with eating kenke? Can you say a little bit about that?
So actually, I recently learned that kenke used to be made with millet and not maize. So I guess my short answer to your question is that it can be made with other things besides maize. The taste obviously will be different and people would have to adapt to that. But I don't in the foreseeable future see that being a big problem. When prices go up, what tends to happen is that the size of the balls gets slightly smaller. So because prices have gone up and other things, including the price of the fuel which they use to make the kenke, also affects the prices. So whether they are using a gas stove or they are using firewood, that affects the price as well. But generally what would happen is that you get a slightly smaller size for the same price. And then over a longer period, the price goes up slightly. But yeah, so in the foreseeable future, I don't see that as a problem.
But would it then have implications for people's nutritional status anyway, if they reduce their portion sizes?
Well, I mean, we eat a lot of carbohydrates. So I think actually most nutritionists will probably say our portion sizes for carbohydrates are too big anyway. So a slightly smaller portion will not kill you. Nutrition-wise, probably would be a better thing. A lot of what we hear when you go to the nutritionist in Ghana is smaller portions. Carbohydrate portions tend to be quite large.
Okay, thanks very much. Amal, there were also a number of questions to you that you've already answered partially. Could you say a little bit more about the broader religious context in South India and how that shapes consumption? This is a question from Derek Johnson, and particularly the differences between Hindu and Muslim consumers, and whether you had any observations about broader Hindu vegetarian norms on fish consumption.
Yeah, I did answer that to Derek. What we did actually, we looked at the low-income households, and when it comes to the low-income household, one would find hardly any difference between the non-veg consumption. And the non-veg consumption, particularly the taboos are associated with of high caste and who seem to be Brahmin and a few other communities, and they tend to be in the higher income group. So within the lower income group, the tendency is less. The preference for all kinds of non-veg is high. But what we observed also in these two cities is that among Muslims and Christians, the non-veg consumption, and which includes fish, this consumption frequency is much higher compared to the Hindu communities. So there would be minor differences in terms of how frequently they consume, but not necessarily whether they consume or not consume.
And I was wondering, because your findings are so different between the two cities because of their location, because of their population makeup. In your perception, what would that mean for policy making or for interventions in the value chain? What are the implications of those differences?
Yeah, one thing that clearly comes out is that one size doesn't fit all. And I think that comes from most of the micro studies that if we look at and try to bring a kind of a standardized uniform policies, then there is high chances that it may fail. Because of non-acceptability of it. And these two contrasting cities gave us an example that the behaviors of consumers, in spite of cities being relocated areas, you find the differences in terms of what they consume and how they consume. So in Chennai, if we try putting freshwater fish or aquaculture fish to the consumer, that it may, as a part of policy, it may not work. And what we also saw is that the formal process works in a city like Bangalore, and whereas there is a set of informality and those relational things play an important role in terms of how the fish is being consumed and who supplies fish to them. So, so the clear thing is that there is plurality and one size doesn't fit all.
And there was also a question about rural areas, and obviously that wasn't included in this study, but how would that extend to rural areas?
It's very difficult given the diversity of India and both regional cultural diversity is difficult to generalize, but one difference that one would say is that in rural area, at least there is a scope to catch the fish for self-consumption purpose, where you don't have to go through a process of market, but urban area, that scope becomes very limited, very, very limited, in fact, because only in places where you have some access to marine areas or access to some kind of freshwater ponds or lakes, you may have some possibility, but that's not there. So that's the difference. And rural areas also bring in the traditionality, what Thijs was saying about what they have been consuming, and that manifests in their consumption behavior. Whereas urban area, there is a kind of a change that that you may see. So, like in these two cities, we saw that there is a continuity that is there in select city like Chennai, in traditional cities, and cities like Bangalore. There is a change of preferences, but cities do bring in some kind of changes. Whereas in rural areas, there is a set pattern which is ingrained in their culture and tradition. So that would be a major difference that I would, in a generalizable way, I would say.
Okay, thanks. So there might be change, but maybe it's a little bit slower in rural areas. Yeah. Kyana, I have a very interesting question for you from Queenie Rizaldo. Were there any taboos on fish consumption during pregnancy and lactation in the area that you studied?
Yeah, so there are still food associated myths and taboos still exist in Madura Island. Foods that are mostly considered taboo for pregnant women, the seafood especially, is the squid and shrimp. And then there are other food as well, but the thing that I know is the squid and shrimp, because it says something about the healthiness of the baby inside. But then the problem is because shrimps and squid is considered a little bit expensive than the boiled fish, then most of the people from rural area doesn't eat it on a daily basis, but then it's still a taboo.
Thanks. And there was another question from Anderson Kwasi Awiring. How do households maintain their fish consumption levels in periods when fresh fish supply is low?
So as I said before in my presentations, most of the household in hinterland, they don't eat fresh fish. They mostly eat the boiled fish, and then some of them also eat dried fish. But then I found that they eat a lot of tofu. So tofu is a great substitution for them, because it can be divided into a lot of portion. And then the dried fish, they consider too dry and has no meat. So it's really hard to divide it into portions. They usually eat in hard season, they call it. They usually eat a milled corn with rice and chopped tofu, for example, and then and a little bit of salt. That's just what they eat, and some wild vegetables.
Okay, thanks. There is a question, another question to you, Kyana, but also to Thijs. So Thijs, be ready also to respond. It's from Yuri Scholtens. To what extent do fervent fish consumers and small-scale fishers actually collectively voice their concerns for the lack of policy and political recognition of small local fish? Is this issue politicized in any way?
To the best of my knowledge, I don't know. This is also very interesting, because I think besides the government policies on promoting to eat more fish, I don't know if this issue is politicized anyway. So this is a big homework to do. Thanks, Yuri, for the questions. But maybe Thijs has a different answer.
Well, I know that, for example, there's a Kesatuan, what is it? A union of the traditional fisheries who advocate the rights of these traditional fisheries, especially in competition to trawlers and foreign trawlers in Indonesian waters. But as in many other cases in Indonesia, the efforts of this union, this Kesatuan, is very much focused on the central islands, Java, Sumatra, Kalimantan, and parts of Sulawesi. And as some of you might know, there's 17,000 something islands in Indonesia. So a lot of places are left out of these discourses or these efforts. And so that is a problem. The rights of there's no politicization of the artisanal fisher folk in Sumba, for example. With regards to consumption, as mentioned by Kyana and I mentioned as well, there's some government policies to promote fish. But again, if you look at what kind of fish they promote, it's mostly taste preferences from Java. There are some small fish included, so some cheap fish included in those programs, but they, I didn't encounter them in Zumba. But mostly the focus is of these programs is on shrimps, squid, and the bigger fish. So like Kyana, I'm not really sure whether there's other forms of politicization of small fish, but what I know is that there's actually there's very little traction for these kind of issues in Indonesia.
Okay, thanks very much. Let's see. We have another question to you, Akosua, which is similar to the point we were discussing earlier, but the other way around. So the question is from Alexander Pounds. In Ghana, if fish are paired with other foods, promoting increased fish consumption might also be promoting those foods. So do you think we need to consider the nutritional impact of increased consumption of foods frequently eaten with fish? And you already alluded to it actually, or mentioned it.
Actually, I can't see the question and you read it a bit too fast.
Apologies. So it's basically this issue of pairing of foods that we were discussing earlier. So the kenke with the fish. So basically what she's asking is, do we need to consider the nutritional impact of increased consumption of foods that are frequently eaten with fish? And you already mentioned it earlier, actually.
Well, yes, we do. Although, like I said before, I think that we will, even if the prices went up considerably, I think two things would happen. One, we would decrease the amount of carbohydrate, which in Ghana is actually a bit too high in general. And two, we would produce it with other, other grains. Because we do know that in our past, we didn't actually make kenke with corn, we made it with millet. So there would be other ways. In terms of our easy adaptability to the other ways, I think that there'll be a debate on whether or not Ghanaians will adapt to that. But we do know from our history that we have adapted to other things. So there shouldn't be that much of a problem. Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much. Ben, there is also a question about the use of small fish for direct consumption versus fish meal production. So how do you see the potential for moving towards increased direct human consumption, and what implications in terms of distribution from source to table would this have? Can you say something about the availability of small fish in the areas where they are typically consumed versus the potential in terms of transporting small fish long distances for human consumption? This is a question from Gatke Pelle.
Okay, so there are a couple of different issues here. I mean, in the two examples that I presented, there is actually very little direct competition between you know, forage sort of reduction fisheries catching forage fish and turning them into fish meal versus you know, fisheries for fish for human consumption. But there is some indirect competition, whereas I think resources get the fish stocks sort of are being distributed between more and more people. Catch per unit effort is going down. There's more and more fishing pressure. You have this sort of fishing down the food web, and you have lots of people actually targeting basically sort of any kind of aquatic organism with very, very fine mesh nets. And then so those kind of very small organisms, juvenile crabs, juvenile fish, where there isn't really a market for human consumption, those end up getting turned into sort of low grade fish meal. And then that obviously is going to have a knock-on effect on the ecosystem, or so it would seem anyway, and then potentially on the abundance of sort of you know, food grade aquatic organisms, if you like. So it's not quite like we see in some parts of India, perhaps, where you have a reduction fishery that's competing directly with a fishery for human use. And I would say that small fish that are being dried are being transported over long distances and have been for millennia, in fact. So they move from the coast or from deltas where there's sort of a surplus, and they've been traded for millennia. And then this is one of those that fish can sort of move further inland. So this has been happening already. I guess now with sort of more international trade, you have this sort of flow of sort of relatively low value small pelagics from Northern Europe, for instance, into West Africa. So that is also occurring in a slightly different context.
Thanks very much. Let me see. There is the question that I asked earlier to Amal about the rural and urban differences. The same question is also went to you, Akosua, and I see you've already answered some in the chat, but maybe you can elaborate.
Yeah, so I think my point is that our foods are paired, right? The carbohydrate goes with mostly fish. And so if you eat a quote unquote Ghanaian diet, you will eat the fish. So I guess the question is whether our diets are changing that much. Among very elite Ghanaians, I think you could say that it's changing. But I don't think that overall the differences are statistically significant. I don't think we are consuming quote unquote a continental diet fully and not eating therefore the Ghanaian dishes. The change, I suppose, will come, but it's not going to be anytime soon, in my opinion.
Okay, thanks very much. I have a question also about local knowledge. Does the local knowledge about fish have any impact on changing tastes of the community, especially the younger generation? How does this affect the sustainability of small fish markets? And I think that's also to you, Akosua.
That's a good question. I mean, I don't think that people eat the fish because it's supposedly healthy. Among the older Ghanaians who go to the hospitals and listen to the doctors, they get that. But among younger Ghanaians, I'm not sure that they're thinking about the benefits or the nutritional value or the processing and its health implications and so on. There is a bit of, I think, class consciousness. So I know that in school with younger kids, for example, you probably don't want to show up all the time only talking about eating Ghanaian dishes. You'd like to talk about how you also eat noodles and that sort of thing. But I'm not sure that in terms of numbers, it's so high that it's overall affecting consumption patterns. I do know that there's a bit of a conversation about noodles and the processed noodles and the nutritional value of that. And yes, there are a couple of stories I've heard about children who only want to eat noodles. But in terms of overall numbers and percentages, I really don't think it's shifting much.
Okay, thanks. And how is that in Indonesia, Kyana?
Yeah, I guess it's also the same that people eating fish is not necessarily because it is healthy, but I do found that some of the younger generations in Madura that is went abroad or move away from Madura, they miss this typical kind of fish that they usually eat. So I guess nostalgic reason is also one of the local knowledge or essential thing that we need to consider in terms of eating fish in Madura. And I think that it is not really having a lot of impact on the sustainability of the fish market because people still eat it on a daily basis, younger or older generations. It's just a different form of it.
And how do you see that, Thijs?
Well, I mean, in Zumba, people eat fish because they like it. But in general, in Indonesia, the double burden of malnutrition is high. There's on the one hand, people who have difficulty accessing enough nutritious food. But on the other hand, there's a giant, or it's a growing group of obese people, mostly eating well, the unhealthy foods, what we consider unhealthy foods, especially the instant foods. And there's a taste for modernity, as I said it. People really have an idea about what is the modern food nowadays. When you get a plate of rice and you get it's topped up with instant noodles, which is, I mean, I'm not a nutritionist, but I wouldn't say that's particularly healthy, and that's considered to be a meal in some parts. There's a lot of changes, but then again, in places like Zumba, the fish consumption is pretty stable. So it's like Amal just said, it's very hard to generalize for places like Indonesia, and as the presentations by myself and Kyana also show, there's many differences in taste, which are very locally based. So yeah.
All right, thanks very much. I think we have time for one final question. There was a question for you, Ben, and I've lost it now. Oh, here it is. The difference in consumer behavior towards small fish in Bangladesh compared to Myanmar. Did you find any fish like mola as highly rich in micronutrients in Myanmar? I guess they also have mola, but they do they have any other species like mola? And this is, I think, this is from Mustafa Hussain, who I think comes from Bangladesh.
Yes, absolutely. We know each other well. So the big difference, I would say, between Myanmar and Bangladesh is in the fermented products. If we're talking about fish consumption. And so in Bangladesh, most processed fish is consumed in dry form, and then there's one specific fermented product that's made with dried fish, and it's a dry fermentation. So the fermented fish is sort of whole fish, whereas in Myanmar, it's like the fermented fish and shrimp products are usually a paste or sometimes a sauce. And so in Bangladesh, the fermented fish is only eaten in certain areas of the country. In Myanmar, it's much more widely consumed, and it's a part of almost every single meal, and very, very many dishes. So that's the big difference in consumption. A lot of the fish species themselves are actually very similar though. And in terms of mola, yes, it's definitely there in Myanmar. And there are probably some other similar species as well, but I'm not sure about the exact details or the micronutrient composition.
All right, thank you very much. So with that, I'd like to thank the panel and also the attendees for all your questions and participating in the polls. This is the end of session 3. Session 4 on trade and distribution will start at 2 p.m. Central European time, so that's in 2 hours from now. I'm not sure, Sharon, if there are any other housekeeping announcements, but otherwise I will close this session.
Sharon, can you put me online, please? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, my video is apparently not working. Maybe it will start in a moment. It will start in a moment. So thank you, Froukje, very much for moderating this session, a very interesting session. Thanks also, Thijs, for actually putting it together. The poll was also a very useful way of getting discussions going. There's 2 things I'd like to say. The first is that, as you may remember, we are planning a technical paper with FAO on the topic of small low-cost fish and food and nutrition security. And we are also interested in contributions from people perhaps in the audience. So the request is that if you have an interest in contributing, please send me a message by email, also indicating the topic, and we will get back to you in the course of the next few weeks. that's one thing. The second, as Froukje has already mentioned, we will be reconvening not at 1 p.m. Central European time, but at 2 p.m. So we now have a decent break. Am I saying it correctly, Sharon? Is it 2 p.m. Central European time? I think so, it is. Okay, thanks all of you for joining us this morning. And we will see you again in 2 hours' time to also talk about the distribution and trade aspect of small fish. So see you in a little bit of time.